Christianity has primed millions of Americans to not just accept the rise of fascism in this country, but to openly embrace it, whether they realize it or not. The Christian nationalist movement grows in power every single day. What might have started out as a more fringe belief system is now a full-blown attempt at an authoritarian theocracy. But this isn't about religion or faith at all. It's about power in the hands of a few people at the top, who honestly might not even believe in the Christian mythology in the first place, but they do know how to wield this religious ideology in their favor. Let's talk about the Christian nationalism to fascism pipeline. Welcome back to the Kayse Melone Show. My name is Kayse Melone, and I'm so glad you're here. Christian nationalism is a term that's been gaining traction and recognition in recent years, and for valid reason. It represents a clear and present threat to democratic ideals under the guise of religious conviction. This is especially true under the current United States administration. But I have been saying for a long time now that Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our civil liberties, our innate human dignity, and our critical thinking here in the United States. In fact, this is so true that many people choose to not call this movement Christian nationalism at all, and instead directly call it Christian fascism, aka a Christian iteration of a far-right authoritarian political ideology. The term Christofascism was coined in 1970 by liberation theologian Dorothy Zolli, which I would argue is an accurate descriptor for what I'm talking about, but that term isn't as widely recognized when we're referring to the religiously fundamentalist political movement on the rise in the United States that I want to talk about today. We will see, though, how Christian nationalism is a direct pipeline and contributor to fascism. Let's get clearer on what Christian nationalism is, though. Scholars like Katherine Stewart, author of The Power Worshippers, and Dr. Kristen Kobes-Dumais, author of Jesus and John Wayne, have done the heavy lifting to help us name and understand this movement. Christian nationalism is the belief that the United States was founded as and should remain a Christian nation governed by biblical principles. But here's the catch. These biblical principles almost always conveniently align with far-right ideology, even though so many people would argue that the things that Jesus actually said were not far-right at all. And we can witness this with the ideas of authoritarian governance, with rigid gender roles, with anti-LGBTQ legislation, the suppression of reproductive rights, and an economic system that rewards wealth and punishes poverty, as I've covered extensively. Katherine Stewart argues that Christian nationalism is not simply a cultural movement, nor is it primarily a reaction to secularism or moral decline, though that is often how it is framed in evangelical Christian pulpits. For those of you new to my platform, I spent 21 years in the fundamentalist evangelical Christian church, attending a Bible-based private high school here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, home of many megachurches with which I was familiar. Suffice it to say, I know firsthand what evangelical Christians in the United States are taught, are manipulated to believe, and are mobilized to vote in favor of. The reason I'm so passionate about exposing the harms of the Christian church in this country is due to, as we will see, the immense harm done in the name of this powerfully dominant religious institution and ideology. And make no mistake, Christian nationalism is, at its core, a political ideology. As Katherine Stewart argues in her work, they are not fighting a culture war, they are waging a political war for power, and that is key. Christian nationalists don't merely want to participate in public life like everyone else, they want to dominate it. And this is so pervasive that I would say the majority of Christians probably do identify with some of the pillars of Christian nationalism without even recognizing the term Christian nationalist applies to them. But the end goal of the people who are openly calling themselves Christian nationalists is not religious freedom for all. It's actually political control under the banner of religious language. And what makes it especially dangerous is that it masquerades and it fools people into thinking that it is about faith. It looks like faith. It speaks the language of faith. I know this because I heard it, again, firsthand from the pulpit countless times during my upbringing. That's why political leaders, honestly, from either political party, who understand the public speaking styles of charismatic Christian preachers are able to sway church congregation members to vote in their favor. But all of this is actually something else entirely. It is a calculated effort to use religious identity as a bludgeon against pluralism, democracy, and human rights. Dr. Kristen Kobes-Dumais adds to this analysis by showing how this movement has been carefully crafted through decades of cultural formation. In Jesus and John Wayne, she unpacks how American evangelicalism shaped itself around ideals of militant masculinity, white identity, and authoritarian strength. And these traits weren't fringe, they were central. Evangelicalism didn't get hijacked by Christian nationalism. It prepared the runway for it. It is the foundation for it. And that is why, when I became an adult and furthered my deconstruction away from evangelical Christianity and started looking at the more subtle and therefore more sinister aspect of the political nature of my upbringing in the evangelical Christian church, I have become more and more concerned about the rise of Christian nationalism. For decades, church communities have been steeped in a version of Christianity that glorifies the warrior Christ, that demonizes feminism and LGBTQ+ rights, and trains congregants to see their political opponents as literal enemies of God. In that sense, the theology was never neutral. It was always political from the start. I've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again here. The religious landscape study conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2023 and 2024 shows that by far, by almost a ratio of 6-to-1, more people are leaving the Christian church in the United States than joining it. And there are many reasons for that, which we will get into more detail in a future segment. This is great news for secular humanists like myself who value human rights over religious beliefs, though. But my prediction, as we continue down the current path of fascism in the current political landscape of the United States, is that as the number of Christians actually declines, we will see the rise of religious fundamentalist extremism and violence. What I mean is the people who double down on these conservative religious beliefs will intensify in their expression of those beliefs. We have seen this in the January 6th insurrection. We have seen this in the religiously and politically motivated murders of a Minnesota lawmaker and her husband. It is heartbreaking to recognize that we will probably continue to see more and more of religiously motivated violence as fundamentalist Christians become increasingly afraid of modernity, human progress, and, well, people who aren't exactly like them. One of the most important distinctions to make here is that Christian nationalism is not the same thing as being a Christian. There are millions of Christians in the United States who are deeply committed to their faith and simultaneously committed to pluralism, democracy, civil rights, etc. Christian nationalism is something else entirely. I recognize that. It's not about practicing faith at all, really. Again, it's about using that faith to impose a narrow, rigid worldview on everyone else. But you can choose to follow Jesus without believing that the United States should be a theocracy. I recognize that. As an atheist who is very familiar with the harms that Christianity causes, both to its adherents and non-believers, though, I personally don't believe that a more progressive iteration of Christianity is enough of a resistance against this danger of Christian nationalism and or Christian religious fundamentalism in general. At the same time, I think there are wonderfully good-hearted, morally sound, everyday Christians who I would stand with in solidarity when fighting injustice, 100%. Just because I don't agree with their choice to maintain the label of Christian or Christ follower doesn't mean I have any right to tell them what to believe. See how that works? I know, it's so groundbreaking. Anyway, let's talk more about why Christian nationalism is so successful. Surprise, surprise, there's a lot of manipulation involved. This religious and political movement depends on weaponizing religious language in ways that obscure its true goals. Terms like religious freedom, which I remember hearing a lot about growing up, are used not to protect diverse expressions of belief, which I found out later, but to carve out legal exceptions that allow discrimination, particularly against LGBTQ people, women, religious minorities, and anyone else who doesn't fit the mold of the so-called traditional family. Family values becomes a euphemism for rejecting queer families, for example. Protecting children becomes a Trojan horse for banning books, criminalizing drag show, and so many other horrific things that have come about as a result of this manipulation. This rhetoric is sanitized, polished, and sold as moral concern, but make no mistake, again, this is a political strategy designed to consolidate power for a specific group of people and to silence dissent. And because it's cloaked in the language of personal faith, it's like hidden beneath the idea of spiritual transformation, it's often difficult to critique without sounding like you're attacking religion itself. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a big proponent of religion in the first place, but all of that is part of the trap because Christian nationalism thrives on this ambiguity. If you push back against the movement, they'll accuse you of being anti-Christian. But that's not the issue that we're really talking about as much as I might adhere to that personally. The issue that we're actually talking about and addressing is using religion as a weapon to suppress human rights, to enshrine second-class citizenship for anyone outside the mold, and to dismantle the democratic framework that allows for religious freedom in the first fucking place. At the heart of this movement is a profound and dangerous revision of American history, which I've talked about before, but I will cover it again briefly for those of you, again, who are new to this platform. Christian nationalists claim that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and therefore must return to those supposed roots. This isn't just historically inaccurate, though, it is politically manipulative. The founders were explicitly wary of merging church and state. This has been proven multiple times. If you really don't believe it at this point, I'm not going to be the one to change your mind. And the Constitution contains no mention of God or Christianity. But facts rarely deter zealots with power, right? Christian nationalism doesn't seek historical accuracy at all. It seeks what it wants to be legitimacy, and it will bend, twist, and fabricate history to gain it. Not to mention, who honestly cares if it was founded as a Christian nation in the first place, which it wasn't, right? Like, obviously, as we're seeing with the way the government is being run right now, the legality of anything, even birthright citizenship, is all up to the whims of one person. So anyway, when we talk about Christian nationalism, we're not talking about personal belief. We're talking about a coordinated, well-funded, and ideologically driven campaign to rewire American democracy from the inside out. It is not a grassroots revival. It is a top-down, politically strategic movement that uses the veneer of religion to justify authoritarianism. If we fail to name it clearly and challenge it boldly, we risk watching it succeed in its mission to create a country where only one kind of person gets to belong. And trust me, that is the goal of this movement. To understand how Christian nationalism evolved into a potent political force here in the United States, we have to revisit the late 20th century, specifically the political maneuvers of conservative evangelicals during the post-civil rights era. One of the most pivotal figures in this evolution was Jerry Falwell Sr., a Southern Baptist preacher who in 1979 founded the Moral Majority. At face value, the Moral Majority was framed as a grassroots movement committed to upholding traditional values, right, and reestablishing America as a Christian nation, particularly seeming to mobilize around the abortion question. If you think about it, framing abortion as the murder of children is the perfect way to mobilize evangelicals toward moral panic. In reality, though, it was all a strategic political coalition that weaponized evangelical language to galvanize right-wing power. Falwell was laying the groundwork for a religious political identity that fused conservative Christianity with the Republican Party, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Falwell's moral majority emerged at a time when conservative evangelicals felt that their grip on the cultural and moral landscape of America was slipping. The feminist movement, the sexual revolution, the teaching of evolution in schools, these were all seen as symptoms of society in decline. Falwell's genius, or curse, depending on how you see it, was in synthesizing all of this into a clear apocalyptic narrative. And we've already covered extensively how the apocalyptic narrative of mainstream Christianity is literally fueling a genocide right now. But going back to what we're talking about here, America had turned its back on God, according to Falwell, and only a return to biblical values could save it. Of course, what counted as quote-unquote biblical was always, again, conveniently aligned with right-wing social policy, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, anti-feminism, pro-militarism, pro-capitalism. The moral majority turned evangelicals into a reliable voting bloc, and Republican politicians were quick to see the advantage. What had previously been a loose cultural posture, being a moral Christian citizen, became a deeply entrenched political identity. But perhaps the most sinister part of this story lies in what actually motivated the formation of the religious right in the first place. And no, it wasn't Roe v. Wade. That's a myth. As historian Randall Balmer has carefully documented, the true origin of the Christian right's political rise wasn't about fetal personhood or religious conscience. It was about protecting segregated schools. After the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision outlawed racial segregation in public schools, many white Christian communities responded not by integrating, but by creating private Christian schools, more accurately, segregation academies. When the federal government began revoking the tax-exempt status of these racially discriminatory institutions in the 1970s, that's when evangelical leaders like Falwell and Paul Weyrich really got mad. Now, there are plenty of arguments against the individual Republican presidents we've had in this country in the last few decades. Ronald Reagan totally sucked. George H.W. Bush did too, and his son was an embarrassment to this country and somehow still better than our current president. Individually, these presidents represented terrible policies and moral ineptitude. But something I always say is they as individual presidents pale in comparison to the actual harm brought about by the Christian conservative televangelists who supported each one of them as individuals. I would argue that the Falwell family, Jerry Falwell Sr. and Jr., and Paul Weyrich are all more responsible for all of the violence brought about by any individual Republican president. They have serious stains on their souls, and I don't even believe in souls. Falwell himself had founded a segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, and openly preached that integration was unbiblical. When the IRS threatened the tax-exempt status of racially exclusive institutions like Bob Jones University, that's when Weyrich, a conservative political activist, saw an opportunity. Weyrich recognized that white evangelical outrage over school desegregation could be the glue to bind a new conservative coalition, and that's exactly what he did. Balmer writes that it was this backlash, not abortion, that truly mobilized the religious right. In fact, many evangelicals were initially ambivalent about abortion in the early 1970s. Some even supported Roe v. Wade, viewing it as a matter of individual conscience or privacy. It wasn't until years later that abortion became the symbolic centerpiece of the Christian right's political brand. But by then, the infrastructure was already in place, built not on theological concerns, but on a deeply racialized defense of private power and white supremacy. This racialized defense of American values was further reinforced during the Cold War, when the threat of communism provided a perfect enemy for evangelical conservatives to rally against. During the mid-20th century, anti-communism became a unifying ideology across various conservative sectors, from Wall Street capitalists to red-baiting politicians to evangelical preachers. Communism was portrayed not just as an economic system, but as a godless, immoral force that threatened the American way of life. Christianity then was rebranded once again, not merely as a religion, but as the ideological bulwark of American identity. To be Christian was to be American, and to be American was to be staunchly anti-communist. Isn't it just so fucking convenient? This conflation allowed evangelical leaders to frame political allegiance as a kind of spiritual loyalty. The battle against the Soviet Union wasn't just geopolitical, it was theological. Evangelicals didn't just oppose communism because of its economics. They opposed it because it was atheistic, collectivist, and egalitarian. Everything white American evangelicals had been taught to fear. In their eyes, communism represented not just a political threat, but a direct assault on God's divinely ordained social order, one in which men ruled over women, white people ruled over people of color, and Christians ruled over everyone else. So when Christian nationalists today claim they are restoring America to its Christian foundations, what they're really referring to is a selective mythologizing of history that conveniently erases the racism, patriarchy, and economic inequality embedded in those so-called foundations. The movement's intellectual DNA is soaked in Cold War propaganda, white grievance, and a craving for dominance cloaked in divine purpose. Ronald Reagan's presidency marked a pivotal turning point in the political merger between American evangelicalism and conservative authoritarianism/fascism. By the time he stepped into office in 1981, the foundation laid by Jerry Falwell's moral majority had already begun transforming white evangelical identity into a cohesive political force. But Reagan didn't just benefit from this movement, he actively sanctified it. He took the conservative Christian base, stirred it into its broader campaign against liberalism and the Cold War, and fused it with the mythology of American exceptionalism, military might, and divine destiny. In doing so, he helped inaugurate what would become the modern Christian Nationalist pipeline, a decades-long project that, by the way, eventually culminated in the events of January 6, 2021. The thing is, Reagan knew how to speak, again, the language of faith, fluently enough to win over evangelicals. He spoke often of God and country as though they were one and the same. And this was not just rhetoric. Reagan aligned his foreign and domestic policies with the priorities of the evangelical right. His administration fought to restrict abortion rights, elevate school prayer, and funnel federal support into religious institutions under the guise of faith-based initiatives. Meanwhile, his aggressive military posture, massive defense spending, expansion of nuclear arms, proxy wars in Latin America and the Middle East was given spiritual reasoning. Evangelical leaders like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell often echoed Reagan's foreign policy goals, painting American militarism as an extension of God's will. Reaganism married evangelical morality with the machinery of empire, creating a narrative in which questioning state violence became tantamount to blasphemy. The fusion of religion and militarism birthed a cultural ecosystem where faith was equated with nationalism, and we're seeing this again more and more now. And then the nationalism is fortified by mythic religious imagery, churches hanging American flags next to the crosses, evangelical sermons including endorsements of military intervention, Hello Palestine. Even Jesus began to look suspiciously like a white gun-toting cowboy in conservative media. You know what I'm talking about. The figure of Christ was transformed from a brown-skinned, anti-imperialist revolutionary into a divine enforcer of Western ideals. It was a bait and switch, and millions of America bought it and still buy it to this day. And this ecosystem didn't fade after Reagan. It deepened under George W. Bush, particularly in the wake of 9/11. The war on terror revived Cold War-style religious polarization, except this time the enemy wasn't communists, but Muslims. Bush regularly invoked God in his addresses, and evangelical churches became hotbeds of pro-war propaganda. Megachurches hosted military appreciation Sundays. Ugh. Evangelical book tables sold patriotic devotionals. I saw those firsthand. Islamophobia became a spiritual virtue, and I can personally attest to this because, again, I was still deep in the fundamentalist evangelical environment, reacting to the supposed war on terror. At the same time, though, Christian nationalism was becoming more insular and paranoid. As the country became more religiously and racially diverse, and as cultural norms continued to shift leftward on issues like same-sex marriage and gender identity, white evangelicals increasingly felt that their power was under threat. In response, the movement grew more militant and more apocalyptic. They began to speak not just of political difference, but of spiritual warfare, another term that I heard about a lot growing up. This means that the opposition wasn't just wrong, it was demonic, and this is how we arrive at the Trump era. And this is why I always say that Christian nationalism is more of a threat to people in this country than Islamic religious fundamentalism on the other side of the world. I'm not negating the existence of serious issues in the patriarchal monotheistic religion of Islam, but I'm also insisting that we focus on the problems we have at home before we continue our age-old practice of enforcing religious identification onto other peoples around this world. Like, can we just take a breather with that, please? Donald Trump was on the surface an unlikely messiah for evangelicals, considering he was twice divorced, vulgar, a former reality TV host with a long trail of moral failings, but that didn't matter to his Christian nationalist base. What mattered was that he promised power, and he delivered for the most part. He gave them Supreme Court justices, he echoed their culture war grievances, he promised to defend religious freedom, which in practice meant the freedom to discriminate, and most importantly, Trump validated their fear and rage. He didn't ask evangelicals to compromise, he gave them permission to want to dominate the rest of this country. And yeah, we're seeing more and more people have regret for their votes for Trump, but the reality is Christian nationalism was behind their vote for him in the first place. Trump was more than just a president in their eyes at the time, okay? Even if they changed their mind now, at the time he was God's anointed one. So many preachers declared that he had been chosen by divine will to restore America's greatness. Churches flew "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president" flags. Some of them preached that opposing Trump was opposing God. The line between state power and spiritual devotion all but vanished, which brings us to January 6, 2021. When insurrectionists stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the results of a Democratic election, they weren't only waving Confederate flags and QAnon signs, I saw. They brought crosses. They carried Christian flags. They marched around the Capitol in a reenactment of the Jericho March, believing if they circled the walls of tyranny, read democracy, and shouted loud enough, God would bring the whole thing crumbling down. This was the, to date, most blatant representation of the extremist intertwining of religion and politics. The Capitol insurrection didn't mark the beginning of the Christian nationalist movement. It was the end of the illusion that this movement was about anything other than power. For decades, white evangelicals were told they were under siege, that their country was being stolen by secularists, socialists, feminists, immigrants, and globalists, and they were told to fight for God and country. And on January 6th, they did. Flags in one hand, Bibles in the other. Not because their faith was under attack, mind you, but because their dominance was slipping away. This is the modern Christian nationalist pipeline. It begins with the nostalgia for a mythic Christian America, passes through Cold War militarism and culture war grievance, and ends with theocratic fascism at the Capitol steps. The danger is no longer fringe. It is the mainstreaming of this belief system that we have to seriously take under consideration. And until we name it for what it is, we'll keep mistaking authoritarianism for patriotism. I say we, I mean Christians, and fascism for faith. Christianity in this context has never been neutral. It has always carried with it the weight of empire. It is not just a belief system. It is a language, the language of the oppressor. Again, this doesn't mean every Christian is an oppressor or that Christianity has absolutely no merit. But it does mean we can't ignore the role it's played as a moral alibi for domination. And again, I will always argue that while I want everyday Christians to have the right to worship however they want, I still believe that Christianity has caused more harm than good on this planet. The cross has too often been a symbol not of liberation, but of conquest. From the Roman Empire to the Spanish Inquisition to the doctrine of discovery, Christian theology has been repeatedly adapted to serve those in power. It justifies violence over and over again. How many times do I have to cover this? And until we confront all of this, not just as a relic of the past, but as a warning for the present, we'll continue to underestimate the role religion plays in upholding systems of oppression. And at the absolute bare minimum, Christianity's alliances with empire, with whiteness, with patriarchy and profit, they need to be broken, because the gospel of the powerful has never been good news for the oppressed. To understand how Christian nationalism primes individuals for authoritarianism, we have to look at the psychology behind it. Political scientist Bob Altmaier has studied this for decades, particularly through his work on the authoritarian personality. According to Altmaier, authoritarian followers tend to exhibit three main traits: submission to strong leaders, aggression towards outgroups, and conformity to perceived moral or religious norms. These traits don't exist in a vacuum. They are cultivated, often from a very young age, and religion, particularly when practiced in rigid or fundamentalist forms, can be a near perfect environment for nurturing them. Let's start with submission. The Bible literally teaches us to have a servant's heart. In authoritarian belief systems, leaders aren't just respected, they are obeyed, often unquestioningly. This isn't the kind of trust built through mutual respect or transparency, oh no. It's allegiance to perceived divine or divinely appointed authority. In Christian nationalist circles, political leaders are often framed as chosen by God. And people, again, they might not actively be calling themselves Christian nationalists, but they still believe that. It is a very convenient and unfortunately brilliant tactic. The rhetoric used to describe them goes far beyond policy alignment. It veers into messianic territory. Trump, for example, has been described by evangelical leaders as a modern-day King Cyrus, a flawed but divinely appointed instrument of God's will. The issue is, once a leader is cast into that role, their sins are not only overlooked, they're reframed as part of God's mysterious plan. It's so convenient. And that brings us to the second characteristic, aggression toward outgroups. In a black and white moral universe, which is how biblical literalism often functions, you're either with us or against us, believers or non-believers. Those distinctions were particularly prevalent in the school and church I went to. There's no nuance, no middle ground, no room for disagreement. The us and the faithful remnant, those who follow God's laws, uphold biblical values, and vote the right way, yada yada. The them is everyone else, secularists, feminists, Muslims, it's even progressive Christians. The outgroup is demonized not just politically, but spiritually. This leads to what Altmaier calls authoritarian aggression, a tendency to direct anger, punishment, or even that which is framed as spiritually motivated violence toward anyone perceived as a threat to the moral order. The third trait, conformity to religious norms, might sound harmless on the surface, but in an authoritarian system, norms are not just social expectations like manners and the etiquette of not listening to your podcast too loudly on the subway. They are absolute truths handed down from a divine source. They are non-negotiable. Hello, fascism. And any deviation is treated as deviance. That is why so many people raised in evangelical communities internalize shame and fear around things like sexuality, gender expression, or even doubt. Questioning the rules isn't seen as a healthy intellectual process, it's seen as rebellion against God. Again, I know this from experience. Like many people raised in fundamentalist Christianity, I was taught that questioning the faith meant putting my soul at risk. Doubt was a doorway for the devil, fear of hell was a constant companion, and the rapture was a legitimate horror movie that I and many others lived in every day. Not to mention all of the ways that being raised in purity culture absolutely devastated my own sexual health before I reconditioned myself. None of that was an accident, though. It was conditioning. It was a system of belief designed to train children in obedience through fear. You don't ask too many questions when you think your eternal torture is on the line. This is what Altmaier means when he says authoritarian followers are often shaped early by systems that reward blind obedience and punish dissent. In Christian nationalist spaces, the Bible is treated as the inerrant word of God. Every verse, every rule, every punishment is literal truth, and there's always a justification for the more violent verses that are in that book. This biblical literalism conditions people to see obedience as the highest virtue, even when it leads to harmful outcomes. Critical thinking is discouraged because it threatens the structure. You're not taught how to interpret scripture, you're taught how to submit to it. Bob Altmaier's work shows us that it isn't just a political problem, it's a psychological and spiritual one. I bring that up a lot. The authoritarian personality isn't born, it's made. And fundamentalist religion is one of the most effective training grounds for creating it. When you raise people to believe that authority is always right, that questioning is a sin, that morality is whatever the leader says it is, you create citizens who will not only tolerate fascism, but demand it. This is the danger of Christian nationalism. It doesn't just influence how people vote. It shapes how they think, how they view the world, how they define right and wrong. It creates a moral framework in which critical thinking is treasonous and blind obedience is held up as sacred. And if we don't actively dismantle dismantle that framework, if we don't offer alternative moral visions grounded in connectivity and empathy and equity and reason, we will continue to see religion used not as a path to liberation or personal transformation, but as a tool of control over and over and over again. When we talk about religion as a system of control, it's tempting to picture something strictly hierarchical, and to some extent that is what it is. There are priests at the top, congregants at the bottom, everyone obeying orders from above. But that misses the most powerful mechanism of religious control, which is the internalization of it. Religion doesn't just work because a pastor says so. It works because it trains you to say it yourself. The most enduring systems of power aren't enforced with whips and chains, they are enforced with belief. I've said that before. With guilt, with fear, with the sinking feeling that even in your private thoughts you might be sinful, that there's something wrong with you that needs to be saved, that there is a messianic figure out there who will save you from yourself. And that's the thing about fear-based belief systems. They don't need constant supervision and, again, the whips and chains to keep people in line. Once they've trained you to associate doubt with danger, and put you in survival mode if you just question the powers that be, they'll let you take care of it. This is what psychologists call self-policing, and it is one of the most powerful tools of fascism. These people don't need to be told not to question authority if they've already internalized the idea that questioning makes them wicked. Rather, they'll stay quiet, they'll stay compliant, they'll keep policing themselves, and everyone else in their community will help them do it. And then they'll start trying to police other people. What we are witnessing is not a culture war, it is a slow motion coup wrapped in Bible verses. It is the rise of a political theology that seeks not to coexist with other worldviews, but to conquer them. And the stakes couldn't be higher, because once religion becomes law, dissent or questioning becomes heresy. And heresy, in the eyes of a theocrat, is treason. So much for religious freedom. Christian nationalism is no longer a fringe ideology operating on the sidelines of American politics. It has become a central force shaping the Republican Party's platform, influencing local school boards like here in Oklahoma where I'm at, and guiding judicial decisions at the highest levels of government. Many people, including moderate Christians, still cling to the idea that true Christianity is apolitical, or that only the extreme versions of religion are dangerous. But neutrality, especially in moments of moral crisis like today, is not neutral. It's complicity. Mainstream denominations that stay silent while Christian nationalism reshapes the political landscape are not standing above the fray, they are permitting it to happen. In fact, it is often the cultural credibility of these more respectable churches that gives cover to the more radical actors on the right. When progressive Christians fail to speak out, or when liberal pastors remain vague or non-committal about issues of justice, they create a space for the loudest and most authoritarian voices to dominate the narrative. Now, there are plenty of Christian leaders speaking out against Christian nationalism, but the question is, will their efforts be enough to stop the rise of fascism and surveillance and conformist control and all of the very serious concerns that this movement threatens us with? This is why we can't afford to treat Christian nationalism as just another point of view in a pluralistic society. It is an authoritarian ideology disguised as religion, and it doesn't seek coexistence at all. It seeks conquest. And it won't be stopped by politeness or neutrality or both sides rhetoric. It will be stopped by people willing to call it what it is, exposing its tactics and fighting for a version of freedom that includes everyone, not just those with a pulpit. One of the most insidious lies that Christian nationalism has sold to the American public is the idea that morality only comes from religion. That without a belief in God, or more specifically their version of God, people are inherently selfish, lost, or dangerous. But the truth is, not only is it possible to be moral without religion, it's essential to disentangle morality from religion if we want to build a truly just and inclusive society. Morality doesn't require a divine command. I've talked about the lie of Christian morality extensively. This is what pluralism actually stands for. It's not just the coexistence of different faiths, it's the acknowledgement that no single worldview should dominate the political system. It's the belief that a healthy society includes a wide range of beliefs and identities, none of which are treated as the default or the gold standard. Christian nationalists hate pluralism because it forces them to share power. But sharing power is exactly what democracy demands, if democracy is even an option at this point. So it's not really enough to say everyone is welcome. We have to actively dismantle the structures that have excluded so many for so long, and that includes calling out theocratic impulses when they show up in policy and public life. We can't afford to be passive observers in this moment. We can't sit back and hope that reason will win the day. Christian nationalism isn't just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to the human spirit. As Britt Hartley puts it, we create dictators, religious leaders, and cult leaders because we so badly want someone else to tell us how to live our lives. That's not just a critique of religion, it's a mirror. It forces us to ask why so many people willingly surrender their agency, their autonomy, their inner voice. Why are we so afraid of the uncertainty that comes with freedom? Why do we cling to authority even when it harms us? The answer, I think, is fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of facing the chaos of life without a script or scripture. But the truth is, freedom is worth the discomfort. Choosing your own moral path, grounded in empathy and shared humanity, is terrifying, but it's also transformative. It means you get to grow, you get to change. It means you get to decide what kind of world you want to build, not just what kind of rules you want to follow. In the end, the fight against Christian nationalism is not just a political battle, it is a moral awakening, it is a spiritual crisis. It's a reclaiming of the idea that goodness doesn't come from fear or shame or blind obedience. It comes from connection, it comes from people, from responsibility, from the radical belief that we are all in this together and that no one needs to be told how to live in order to do what's right. If you liked this segment of the Kayse Melone Show, I would be so grateful if you checked out some of my other work and became a member on the YouTube channel so that you can get access to private channels in the Kayse and Friends Discord. But either way, do join the Kayse and Friends Discord. We have great conversations there all day, every day, and I would love to get to know you better. And with that, I'll see you next time.